Hello, and a very warm welcome to this Arden Shakespeare Folio Matters panel discussion. We're delighted that so many of you have been able to join us here today. We're coming to you today from the Bloomsbury office in Bedford Square, but we have participants and audience members from all around the world, which is wonderful to see. As there are so many of us online, everyone other than our speakers will be muted and won't have their video either, just to keep distractions to a minimum. The chat option is also closed to avoid distractions because of the audience, but we will have time for questions at the end of the session, and you can post those questions in the Q&A function as we go along. If you look at the top of your screens, if you're not familiar with Teams, you'll see an icon for Q&A, and that's the icon to use if you want to post a question. Please note, as you should have seen, that this session is being recorded, and so we'll be able to make it available to rewatch at a later date. Thank you. So I'm Margaret Bartsley, and I'm Editorial Director for the Arden Shakespeare. And I'm joined today by two of our general editors for our forthcoming fourth series of plays, poems and sonnets, Professors Tiffany Stern and Peter Holland. Unfortunately, our third general editor, Zachary Lesser, isn't able to join us today. We're so pleased as well that one of our three advisory fellows, Robert Stagg, will be taking part today, together with Patricia Akhimie and Urvashi Chakravarty, both of whom are working on new editions of Othello and A Midsummer Night's Dream, respectively, for the fourth series. Helping things run in the background are my colleagues Jade Grogan, commissioning editor at Arden Shakespeare, and Vivian Quick, our marketing manager. I'd like to thank everyone for their help today in making what I'm sure will be a really stimulating session happen. The Arden Shakespeare series has long set the gold standard in textual editing and in producing landmark editions for each generation. The third series started publishing in 1995 and was finally completed in January 2020 with the publication of Measure for Measure. Even before the third series was completed, we'd started to think about what a fourth series might offer and who might be best placed to help us deliver a new generation of world-class editions. While the new fourth series won't launch until early 2025, we now have all of the editions under contract with a diverse range of international scholars, all now at work editing their chosen texts in earnest. We wanted to play our part in the current Folio celebrations by shining a light on some of the textual questions an editor must grapple with when editing a text anew, especially in light of recent critical and theoretical developments, which guide us to produce more relevant and meaningful editions for contemporary students, scholars, actors and theatre makers, as Arden has always done. Today's session is therefore focusing on editing gender, race and queerness, looking at the specific challenges thrown up by folio versions of The Tempest, Othello and A Midsummer Night's Dream. Several more of our volume editors have also created some short videos on the plays they're editing for the series for our Folio Matters series on social media, each taking a few minutes to explain a particular textual crux they're wrestling with in the folio text of their play. Please follow @Arden Publisher, if you don't already, on Twitter, X, to find out more. And the first film went live today from Peter Kerwin, who's editing The Winter's Tale for the series. So in a moment, I'm going to hand over to Robert Stagg to start things off for us, explaining how the advisory fellows have been working with the volume and general editors to foreground contemporary research, such as early modern critical race studies, early modern trans studies and adaptations in the quarterly bulletins they share with the full Arden 4 team. Robert will also be talking us through a particular textual moment in Romeo and Juliet as an example of the sort of questions editors must grapple with. After that, Tiffany, Patricia and Urvashi will each speak about a particular folio issue in the plays they're editing, namely The Tempest, Othello and Dream. Lastly, we'll then open up to a short Q&A session led by Peter Holland. So please, as I say, post questions in the Q&A function on Teams. Again, the icon for that is at the top of your screens. as we go along, and we'll try to answer as many as we can in the closing moments of the session, and we'll try to select questions that most represent common questions that are appearing and things that really speak to the subject of today's session. So I hope that's all clear. As I say, we're delighted. We now have over 100 people joining us, which is fantastic. So thank you all for coming along and for your interest. And I'm going to hand over to Rob to kick us off. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Margaret, and thanks to Vivian and Jade and to everyone tuning in. As Margaret says, there are over 100 of you and the number is just ticking up as I look at the screen. Okay, every time someone complains about being quoted out of context, I begin to slightly roll my eyes, even when the complaint's directed towards Professor Jordan Peterson, as in this subheading from a UK newspaper. Because quotation is by definition the removal of text from its context. It's characterized by exclusion as much as by inclusion, or as well as by inclusion. But the gist of the complaint that someone has been quoted out of context is really an appeal for responsible quotation, a mode or instance of quotation that can hint at or do some justice to the material that's been left behind, the material that exists outside the quotation marks, and which does not blatantly misrepresent it or exist in misleadingly stark contrast to it. And something similar might be said of scholarly editing. Editions cannot include everything, indeed should not contain everything, but even acts of editorial exclusion can gesture to what has been excluded. In the quarterly bulletins the Arden 4th Series Fellows have been providing for volume editors, we've thought about numerous editorial acts of inclusion and exclusion. Consider the couplet. Here's an example. Let's think about the couplet in which Romeo describes Juliet upon first seeing her as it appears in the Folio. It seems she hangs upon the cheek of night as a rich jewel in an Ethiop's ear. And then let's think about its editorial treatment in a number of 20th century editions. And I'm anonymizing these editions because my intention is to be broadly illustrative of an editorial tendency or tendencies rather than being individually critical of what's very fine scholarly work. So in this instance here, you can see if you look at number 45, Ethiop, night is personified here as an Ethiop, with Juliet as a lustrous pendant with a cross-reference to Two Gentlemen of Verona. This editorial gloss, this edition, pictures the couplet as an essentially allegorical kind of phenomenon and avoids glossing the word Ethiop, even as it pertains or signals to be doing that, to be doing just that. What's really being glossed here, I think, is the presence of night in the couplet. Other editorial notes, like this one, avoid glossing the couplet altogether. Others refer the reader to kindred instances, although not so kindred as to include an Ethiop. The example which you'll see on your screen now refers the reader to a line from Marlowe's Hero and Leander, no Ethiop there, as you can see. Other editions gloss the Ethiop in brackets as being somewhat incidental to the main point of reference. If you look at the bottom of page 192 here, the final note, you can see Ethiop equals person with black skin, confined to parenthesis. Is it sufficient as well to gloss the word Ethiop as person with black skin, or do we need to know more? One edition ventures a little further. Ethiop is glossed here as an Ethiopian, black African. Yet would a reader benefit from a still more specific and detailed gloss? Perhaps a gloss that mentioned the proverb and the Aesopian fable of washing the Ethiop white, or a gloss that explains some of the legends of Prester John and his Christian kingdom, supposedly based in Ethiopia? Or would those notes be otiose, excessive, fussy? Well, if such material does seem within the reasonable ambit of a commentary note, why is it not in these notes that you've been seeing? Well, I think because scholarly priorities, and with them editorial priorities, have changed in the years since these editions were published. That's one reason why an Arden 4th series should appear relatively hot on the heels of the Arden 3rd series. In recent decades, scholars have argued that there has been an historic tendency to downplay or disregard racialized language in plays that do not seem to be conspicuously about race. If I'd chosen one of the so-called race plays, as Ayanna Thompson has called them, rightly putting those words race plays in sarcastical inverted commas, plays like Othello or The Merchant of Venice, we might expect to find more overt attention to racial matters in these 20th century editorial commentary notes. Now, as David Sterling Brown and others have drawn our attention to what Brown calls Shakespeare's other race plays, i.e. all of his plays, since none of Shakespeare's dramas achieve an escape velocity from questions of race, editors will want to broaden or to refocus their annotations of plays like Romeo and Juliet to properly accommodate and address these racial moments, however fleeting and protean and tricky they may be. In addition, recent scholarship has emphasized that whiteness is not, in Arthur Little's words, an unmarked property, a colorless norm, somehow raceless or standing outside race, that it's as much a racial category as, say, blackness. An editor who is not thought as such might not quite see the alto rilievo effect by which Juliet's shining whiteness is differentiated from the Ethiop's black ear or knight's black cheek, or might not see it as a specifically racial colour effect, despite, one would think, the relatively obtrusive presence of the Ethiop. There is an understandable reticence about comprehending such flashes of colour in exclusively racial terms, especially when, as Vanita Seth has argued, quote, it's impossible to know with any certainty what our modern predecessors saw when they saw colour. Take a look at this example, coming up on your screens. Is the jewel hung in ghastly night, which makes black night beauteous and her old face new, in sonnet 27, is that quite the same as the jewel explicitly and specifically in an Ethiop's ear in Romeo and Juliet? Might another annotational register be required for these lines in the sonnet with different editorial emphases? And something of an aside, I wonder if Juliet is masked when Romeo rhapsodizes of the Ethiop's ear, etc. It's generally assumed that she isn't, but what would happen if we thought of her as being masked at this moment in the scene? How might that complicate the scene's racial colorations? And is it an editor's business to point out potential or actual contradictions, inconsistencies, ambiguities, confusions, puzzles of just this kind? I've been referring to the aforementioned two lines from Romeo and Juliet as a couplet, but they're only a couplet of sorts, and perhaps not really a couplet, strictly speaking. The lines don't rhyme, even if they act as a semantic unit, and they're among a series of lines that the Victorian connoisseur George Saintsbury saw as being, quote, representative of the battle of the couplet and of blank verse. Now, by Saintsbury's reckoning, the true couplet in Romeo's speech, which you can see here, is, oh, she doth teach the torches to burn bright, it seems she hangs upon the cheek of night. At that point, Saintsbury ventures, blank verse rather joins battle with the couplet and adds that further line as a rich jewel in an Ethiop's ear, unspooling the couplet into more concatenated verse. If Saintsbury's right, exactly or approximately, what should the editor be glossing? In the various editorial examples I've supplied earlier, the editors tag their gloss to numerous points in these lines, and indeed in lines that go beyond and before what you can see on your screens at the moment. Some editors claim to be glossing the word Ethiop in particular, others to be glossing 2 lines, others to be glossing 3 or more lines. The lemma, the word or words entered in bold typeface in the commentary notes, the word or words supposedly being glossed, the lemma itself acts rather like a quotation, and the age-old complaint about being quoted out of context starts to rear its head. Can an editor really gloss the word Ethiop without providing some sort of surrounding or supporting gloss upon the lines in which the word resides? If the black and white conceit of these lines, as the Arden 3 editor René Weiss described them, if that conceit extends yet further, down to the snowy dove trooping with crows, a couple of lines after the Ethiop's ear, then yet another editorial conundrum emerges. Is Juliet like a snowy dove, as the folio has it on your screen, or is she like a snow white swan, as the first quarto has it, with Q1 rather underlining and including that word white, the coloristic, perhaps racially coloristic aspect of the image, and indeed with its subsequent reference at the foot of the page here to Juliet as being this fair lady. What does an editor, with eyes open to the racial colour of this moment, do? Is racial commentary something that happens in or through the collation notes, as well as in the gloss, acknowledging that constructions of race are as much a textual and bibliographical as a societal or geographical matter? And this question of where to treat race, where an editor should treat race, is quite a vexed one. If you give the subject its own section in the introduction to an edition, for instance, you allow it a prominence that it might not have had in previous editions. However, such a decision also implies, doesn't it, perhaps that race can be fenced off from other areas of Shakespearean study, whether that be language or versification or performance, when race is precisely constituted by those things. Even acts of editorial inclusion, then, are fraught with difficulty. My introductory comments here rather generally foreshadow the much more detailed remarks that Arden 4 editors will make in the course of this webinar about the texts with which they're so closely involved. And although I've concentrated just on how editors might address a number of racial matters in a couple of lines of Romeo and Juliet, I hope what I've said also has a wider resonance as to what editors do and what they don't do, and when and where they do it or don't do it. So here ends my sermon. I'll pass the virtual microphone to Tiffany Stern, General Editor of the Arden Shakespeare 4th series and editor of The Tempest for Arden 4, about which she'll be speaking now. Over to you, Tiffany.
Thanks so much, Rob. That was a really interesting and useful talk for situating exactly the kinds of things we're dealing with. And I am going to show one such problem, and maybe a couple more if I have time, that I'm dealing with in The Tempest. And so here, this is a location shot. And this is the little exchange that I'm going to be talking through, which, as you can see, involves Pro, that's Prospero, Cal, that's Caliban, and Mirror, that's Miranda. But what I'm going to ask is, did Miranda speak this speech that's given to her here or not? And I'll explain the nature of the problem, and you'll see how loaded and tricky it is. And I'll also tell you right now that I haven't yet solved it. I'm still confused about what to do with this. So let me move to the next slide now, where you can see I've just cut this down a little bit, but I'll situate what's going on here. Prospero is being furious with Caliban. Prospero says, "Thou most lying slave, whom stripes may move," that's hits, striking you, not kindness. And Prospero is furious with Caliban because Caliban has tried to violate the honor of my child. He's tried to rape Miranda. And Caliban says, "Oh ho, would it had been done." So he says, "Well, I wish I'd done that." Okay, so that's the exchange so far. And then here is the question. Miranda, according to the folio, now speaks. And what she says is this. She starts with, "Abhorred slave." She's addressing Caliban, and obviously she's being furious with him. And she's also calling him a slave. And as you saw above, Prospero also called him slave. And this is partly a literal definition of what he is, because Prospero has enslaved him. And it's also slave as a sort of lowering insult. And she says, "Abhorred slave, I pitied thee, took pains to make thee speak, but thy viled race, though thou didst learn, had that in it, which good natures could not abide to be with." So she says he's a slave and he's vile and she refers to his race, which is a little different from what we mean by race, but not that different. She means a type, a group, a type of people, and he's of a vile type. So, and now let me tell you what's happened to this this exchange historically. So historically, people have found this exchange very difficult. And what they've found really tricky is Miranda being so angry, so brutal in the way she speaks, so full of insults. And so since the 1660s, Miranda's name has been changed here to Prospero. And it's been Prospero who has said all of this. And that's to kind of save her as a sort of lovely girl. She's a 15-year-old and she's the love interest. And so so she's been kind of rescued from this speech. And then, so Arden 1, for instance, in Arden 1, this was Prospero's speech. But in Arden 2 and in other texts of around that time, the speech was triumphantly returned to Miranda, as it is in the Folio. And it was returned to Miranda using this argument that people were saying, well, Miranda is confronting her rapist and saying what she thinks, and she's being an empowered woman. Now, what's interesting in both those different takes on who speaks the speech, trying to rescue Miranda as a sweet woman or trying to see her as an empowered woman, you can see that both of those are reflections of the thoughts of their time. So both those are readings that are trying to get Shakespeare's text right, but are also reflecting their own age. That becomes important in a second when I tell you my thoughts. So I'm looking at this and I have to decide, does Miranda speak this speech or does Prospero speak this speech? And what I mustn't do is choose who I want to speak the speech. I'm not a director. I don't have that kind of choice. I've got to work out what I think is going on in the text. And here's what's confusing me, that what Caliban says next is, you taught me language, and my profit on it is I know how to curse. So what Caliban seems to say to the person who's just said this speech to him is, you taught me to speak language, and all I gained from that is now I can swear. Well, if he says that to the person who said a horrid slave to him, well, if that's Miranda, then we know Miranda was about 3 when she arrived at the island. So did she, as a 3-year-old, teach Caliban to speak and also teach Caliban to swear? And we're thinking, well, surely not. No, surely the person who did that was Prospero. So if Caliban replies, as it were, to Prospero, does he reply round the corner from Miranda back to Prospero, which is possible? Or should this speech, in fact, be Prospero's speech? If the speech that says mirror were Prospero's speech, how would the wrong speech heading have got there? Well, what's interesting to me is that elsewhere in the play, there are 2 speeches by Antonio and Sebastian, which are reversed. They have the wrong speech headings. And the explanation for that has been that the compositors, the printers in the printing house, had names ready set in type and would pick up a full name and slot it in. And the explanation has been that they slotted in the wrong name. So here's my question. Was in fact mirror wrongly slotted in, which would allow this to be a Prospero speech, or not? And here now is my problem. I sort of want this, I kind of want this to be a Prospero speech. But then I wonder, just as all other editors are reflecting their times, am I in danger of reflecting my time? And do I want to rescue Miranda from calling Caliban a slave, referring to his vile race? Do I want to save all the racism and horror for Prospero? So therefore, can I trust my own feelings? And the other thing I'm conscious of, if I do change this to Prospero, it will seem like a weirdly old-fashioned thing to do. I certainly couldn't dream of doing that if I were a male editor. I can only think of it because I'm a female editor. But you see my problem and you see my confusion with all of this. Let's hop to the next slide. I'll show you very briefly some other things which also relate. Okay, here's a situation slide. This is the very end of The Tempest. There's The Tempest last page. And you can see there's the epilogue on the left, and on the right, there's this weird bit of extra textual information which isn't in the play. And let's now just go to the next slide and look at it bigger. Right, there's that bit of information. And maybe it's here just to fill in some space in that page. We don't know who wrote this information. Was it written by Shakespeare, or was it, as seems quite likely, written by the scribe Ralph Crane, who wrote out the manuscript for this play? What you can see, it says it's got the name of the actors, but it hasn't. It's really the name of the characters. And if you click on the next bit, yeah, these names, these are all men. So it ranks men first. And you can see that the men in this list are ranked by hierarchy. So the King of Naples is the top ranking character, even though he's not the key character in the play. And it goes down through ranks. So then you get the real Duke, then the pretend Duke, and so forth and so forth. But this is interesting in terms of rank. So for instance, Caliban ranks somewhat in the middle. He ranks higher than Trinculo and Stefano, the drunken jesters. And Caliban also has an interesting descriptor here. He is called a salvage, that's savage, and deformed slave. Tricky, there's that word slave again. Is slave here a descriptor that also has that awful nuance that Prospero gives it? And it's very interesting also that what's singled out here is that he's deformed. Might his vile race be a reference to his deformity? So these are all difficulties that I still have to deal with. And if we go through the other bracket now, yep. So these, you'd think these would all be women. The top ones are all men. You'd think these would all be women. Top woman Miranda, but next person down, Ariel, he's male. So what is this even a list of? It's a list with some kind of ranking, but what's going on? And the more I look at this list, the more I think, oh, it's not as I first assumed, men and then women. It's men and then people who are played by boys. But if this list is men and boys, that makes it more likely to be a theatrical list than a list for readers, which now makes it possibly more performatively important to the play. And one very brief last thing I'll look at here on this page is this. We're told what the scene is, the location, an uninhabited island. Well, that's very awkward. It's not uninhabited at all. If it were, there wouldn't be much of a story. But is this, again, nuanced? Does uninhabited mean that the island before Prospero and Miranda arrived there was uninhabited? Well, it wasn't. Ariel the spirit and Caliban were living there. But are they not ranked? Are they not ranked? And is that because they're not people, they're a spirit and a half witch? Or is it a horrible assumption that they're not like lovely Prospero and Miranda, and therefore they don't count as people precisely? So anyway, I'll stop there. These are the problems, the questions, the oddities that I am dealing with as I think through the issues with The Tempest. Thank you very much. Oh, and I'll pass on to Patricia.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the challenges that I've encountered in editing Othello. And my guides through this process have very much been my fellow editors, including past editors of the play. So the tragedy of Othello, the Moor of Venice, is a key document, I would say, in the history of race and racism. It's instructive and not necessarily in a positive sense. And there are those who've argued that the play should be studied but not performed because of its damaging potential. The verbal and physical abuses of Othello, a character who is identified as having dark skin and is referred to as a Moor, the abuses of his character, his body, these are a spectacle that audiences can, even if accidentally, be encouraged to enjoy. And so editorial work on this play is key in allowing layers of text and omission to do a more careful and constructive kind of performative work in creating space for alternative readings and anti-racist ends. And I'm going to focus on a moment in Act 1, Scene 2, which is a crucial one for readers invested in understanding the literary history of race and racism, though it's one that hasn't received much attention in criticism or in editorial commentary. And this is the moment when, after having eloped with Desdemona, Othello stands with his ensign, the duplicitous Iago, and his lieutenant, Cassio, who has recently been promoted instead of Iago, outside the Sagittary. They're approached by an angry group led by Rodrigo, who's secretly in league with Iago, and Brabantio, Desdemona's father, who is irate. The play exists in several early versions, including the 1622 quarto and the first folio of 1623, and I'm showing you those here side by side so we could see this together. This moment lasts just a few seconds in performance. Iago asks Othello if he's ready to leave for the Senate to answer the Duke's call for his assistance with military matters. Just as Othello answers, "Have with you," Cassio sees and announces the arrival of another group. Iago confirms that it is Brabantio. Othello calls out to them to stop, but Rodrigo and Brabantio are intent. Rodrigo identifies Othello as the Moor, and Brabantio calls him thief. Poised for a violent interaction, Iago seems to threaten Rodrigo, who is in fact his co-conspirator. And at this moment, in both texts, Othello speaks, de-escalating the situation with his charismatic brand of forceful but fair authority, and saying to whomever has drawn, "Keep up your bright swords, for the dew will rust them," or rustum in the quarto. There's only one printed stage direction, and herein lies my problem. The printed stage direction is the entrance stage direction. It comes a little earlier in the quarto than in the folio, as Brabantio and Rodrigo enter with unnamed others and their lights and weapons, or officers and torches in the folio. In the quarto, this entrance precedes Iago's question to Othello, "Will you go?" So that Othello's response reads as almost sarcastic. "Ha, with who?" As in, which group of nosy Venetians come to interrupt my wedding night should I accompany first? There are no other stage directions printed. But many would argue that this passage contains what has been called an implicit stage direction, indicating that one or more players should draw a weapon, most likely a sword. The implicit stage direction emerges from the dialogue, from Iago's cryptic question, "You, Rodrigo," in the folio, or his statement, "You, Rodrigo," in the quarto, and his invitation, perhaps, to cross swords with Rodrigo or someone else, "Come, sir, I am for you." And also from Othello's command, "Put up your bright swords," which suggests that at least two swords, and possibly more, have been drawn. Editors have sought to formalize this implicit stage direction by adding it to the text, often set off in the margins or enclosed in square brackets to indicate that the stage direction is not drawn from the base text of folio or quarto. This tradition begins with the dramatist Nicholas Rowe, the 1709 edition of the complete works. Rowe adds, "They draw on both sides," in the right-hand margin after Brabantio's "Down with him, thief." Now, the current consensus amongst textual critics is that editors should strive to be as unobtrusive as possible, but as you're hearing today, that's quite difficult to achieve. And a review of editorial emendations over the centuries reveals clear attempts to sort of influence the way that the scene plays out, and where aggression originates and where fault may lie. The vast majority of editors from the 1700s through the 20th century follow Rowe's lead by printing "they draw" on both sides in the margin or in the dialogue under Brabantio's outburst. This includes the Shakespearean editors of the 18th and 19th century like Pope, Johnson, Malone, and Collier, and 20th century editors of the Arden Shakespeare first, second, and third series, Hart, Ridley, and Honigman. Similarly, in Lewis Wright and Virginia Lamar's 1957 Folger edition, they specify the weapon with the stage direction, "both parties draw swords." And Michael Neal's more recent Oxford edition gives "both sides draw their swords" and notes that this stage direction is a paraphrase or substitution for Rowe's. These choices emphasize opposition and evoke a violent free-for-all between two factions. And a few editors follow the base text by adding no stage direction at all, including Norman Sanders' 1984 Cambridge edition and Kenneth Muir's 1968 Penguin edition. One of my favorites is Edward Capel, perhaps the most intrusive of all, who adds the incendiary stage direction, "Brabantio and his party set upon the others," and attributes the violence and its sudden start to Brabantio and his group, giving Othello and his supporters a clear claim to something like self-defense in any ensuing melee. More recently, in the 2016 Norton Shakespeare, we have Iago drawing "you, Roderigo," and in the 2017 New Oxford Shakespeare, Iago drawing his sword, "you, Roderigo," and these will lay the blame squarely on Iago. He alone draws a weapon. He alone calls out Roderigo. Another favorite, Horace Howard Furness's 1886 Variorum edition, includes the personal notes of his friend, the actor, Edwin Booth, whose vision of the scene is fully wrought and unquestioned based on his own experience of the play and performance. Booth says, "Othello's party, Cassio, Iago, and others should motion to draw. Brabantio's friends enter with swords drawn." So far, only a handful of editors have opted for the maximum indeterminacy in Act 1, Scene 2, offering vague statements like, "they draw swords," "they draw their swords," or even simply, "they draw," set off in the right-hand margin. And this is a choice that welcomes the reader to participate in the decision-making process, or rather, in the exploration of the range of textual and performance options that are possible. Although I'll add that in a recent conversation with an expert in stage fighting, he points out that at the moment you use the verb draw, you have limited the possibilities for what might be happening with the swords as stage properties or other objects as stage properties on the stage. That perhaps it's not that they've been drawn, but perhaps they've been lifted from the ground or placed on the ground. So there's yet another layer of complexity. But my point here is that adding stage directions with or without brackets is an interpretive act, and particularly when racializing language or behaviors are a factor in the performative logic of the scene or of the play. And this is what has made it so difficult for me to figure out what my reader might need from me as editor in glossing this scene and including or not including stage directions. It's the uncertainties in this scene that enable race thinking, because it relies on audiences to co-create race. Here, audiences are made to intuit the added danger of the nighttime setting, the frightful import of the weapons and the torches, the incensed kinsmen, and the nameless officers of the law, the blackness of the body they seek, and the vulnerability of that flesh. The implicit stage direction is a decision point at which the text and its performance possibilities are continually in conversation with the lived experience of us as readers, as audiences. I think this moment for me in Act 1, Scene 2 is first and foremost a fantasy about a world in which a valiant Othello or his real world analog can put a stop to racist violence with a commanding word and a simple gesture. If we examine the scene through the lens of recent attention to racial inequity in the use of lethal force by law enforcement, or simply the long history of anti-Black racist violence, we as modern readers may be led to pay closer attention to the work that editorial emendation, omission, in addition to performance choices, does in producing Othello as either invulnerable or as suspect. And I will leave you with that problem and pass the microphone to Urvashi Chakravarty.
Thank you so much, and thank you to Margaret, Jade, Vivian, the other panelists, and to all of you for coming. So I'll begin with a very famous line, if I may, from A Midsummer Night's Dream. Bless thee, bottom, bless thee, thou art translated. These words, spoken by a confounded Peter Quince to Bottom, now wearing the head of an ass, almost always elicit a roar of laughter from the audience in performances of A Midsummer Night's Dream. But what does it mean to be translated? We may laugh at this line in part because it reads and sounds like a euphemism. The word translated means to be changed, converted, even transported. But translation also conveys the sense of transfer, of possession or dispossession. Thus, when Helena seeks to express the extent of her as yet unrequited love for Demetrius at the start of the play, it's the language of translation that she reaches for when she remarks to Hermia that, were the world mine, Demetrius being fated, the rest I'll give to be to you translated. I also find myself reaching for and reflecting on the language of translations for a few different reasons. Firstly, translation may be a productive way to think about the appropriations and reimaginings that run within and without the play, so that even when Helena describes her pursuit of Demetrius, for instance, she analogizes it to the story of Daphne and Apollo, but changes that story so that, as she says, Apollo flies and Daphne holds the chase. A gender reversal that for her comprises what she calls a scandal on my sex. When productions stage Helena as a male Helenus or present a female Lysander, for instance, as they have done in recent years, they underscore Dream's availability to these configurations and reconfigurations of gender and sexuality. Translation, I think, also comprises a generative term for the project of thinking about race, gender, and queerness in the process of editing. As someone at a relatively early stage of editing her play, I find myself wondering whether editing might be not just an act of interpretation for the current moment, but also itself a form of translation, which, amongst other things, renders the rhetorics of early modern racial formation, gender and sexuality legible for readers and audiences now, but which also necessarily traffics in translation's economy of change, conversion, exchange and possession. This is particularly pressing, I think, in a play that is in many respects about transformation. Certainly Bottom's various dramatic translations are indicated in the play by a range of textual speech prefixes, which signal bottom, clown, and pyramus, prompting us to ask, what do these different speech prefixes denote about identity? What does identity consist in? These textual changes are, however, eclipsed by Bottom's more spectacular transformation, which is both arresting and coerced, funny and chilling in equal measure. As we know, Bottom's subjected to this cross-species asinine translation because Oberon, the king of the fairies, seeks to punish his queen, Titania, for refusing to relinquish a little changeling boy from India, and the punishment is to have her fall in love with the first creature she sees, after he laces her eyes with a love potion. The cross-species implications of her infatuation have formed the basis of path-breaking queer and sexuality studies scholarship about A Midsummer Night's Dream, including on the more than hints of bestiality in the play. But the unnamed and unstaged little Indian boy can present an editorial conundrum or a gold mine. The Indian child has two origin stories in the Folio and in earlier texts, which can be, but which are never explicitly reconciled in the play. So according to Robin Goodfellow on the left, on the screen, this child is a lovely boy stolen from an Indian king. According to Titania, his speech is on the right on the screen, his mother was a votaress of my order, an intimate for whose sake, she says, I do rear up her boy. Scholars including Abdulhamid Abbas, Margot Hendricks, Anya Lumba and Josna Singh have unfolded the context of colonial control, race and sexuality around this moment. Whereas in Titania's telling, the unnamed Indian boy is akin to something like a transracial adoptee, in Park's version, the Indian boy has been stolen, a term that suggests kidnap, but which also invokes a longer and larger sense of colonial theft. Any editorial gloss here might also register that the scholar Imtiaz Habib has proposed a more violent context of compulsory servitude for this child, arguing that the lovely boy recalls Indian persons who were captured and forcibly transported to England. Depending on how we gloss that word lovely, moreover, as not just beautiful or beloved, but potentially to mean loving, this passage might also suggest that the Indian boy is reciprocally affectionate, potentially excusing or exculpating any colonial theft. For a character who's neither named nor staged, then, the Indian changeling is freighted with a huge amount of significance and uncertainty in terms of how we read the racial and colonial dynamics of the play. And any editorial apparatus must additionally take into account, or grapple with how much to take into account, the performance history of this figure and the long-running questions and quandaries it introduces. Should a production stage this character at all, and if so, how? What are the implications of a staged Indian child's age, gender, and race? Conversely, what would it mean for the child not to be embodied at all, but instead to be represented by a doll or a puppet? How does an editor take account of this dramatic history, and how much do they signal in the commentary itself? As important as these questions around the Indian child are, I also want to think through how editorial work on the play necessitates thinking more capaciously about where and how the process of racial formation is generated, moving beyond racialized characters to racial heuristics and vectors of power. One of the most infamous and conspicuous instances of such race thinking in the play is, of course, the moment when a bewitched Lysander angrily dismisses his former beloved, Hermia, with the words, "Away, you Ethiop." Robert Stagg has wonderfully outlined the implications of this term in Romeo and Juliet. Here, too, Ethiop signals a term of derision, and previous editorial commentary has suggested that it gestures to Hermia's dark hair or skin and or to the figure of an African. Hermia, we recall, has repeatedly been described as fair before this moment by Theseus and by Helena, confirming the apparatus of gendered whiteness in the text and the play's investment in the dichotomies of light and dark to bolster hierarchies of race and power, a process which Kim Hall's scholarship crucially unfolds. Matthew Chapman, meanwhile, has suggested that the term Ethiop underscores the play's pervasive affective undercurrent of anti-blackness, as productions of the play either reproduce this line without comment or, as I've seen recently, omit it unthinkingly, which has, I think, the unintended effect of absolving Lysander of personal animus whilst potentially leaving the larger structures of racial hierarchy in the play intact. These are complicated and sometimes contradictory dynamics ranging from cultural history to contemporary performance, and which leave open the question how much of this can or should an editorial gloss convey. I'd like to end by gesturing to a couple of textual moments in the folio that I think productively expose and place pressure on these larger racial hierarchies, in particular by pointing to the play's interest in lineage and whiteness and in the preservation of both. For instance, when Lysander and Hermia discuss the impediments to their love at the beginning of the play, namely that Hermia's father Aegeus insists that Hermia must marry Demetrius, Lysander famously muses that the course of true love never did run smooth, offering as one example of the obstacles in true love's path its dependence on the choice of merit, and that's in the folio on the right-hand side. Here, however, the folio departs from the quarto, which is on the left on the screen, replacing the choice of friends with the choice of merit. What does this change signify? Friends might suggest kinship and patronage networks. Does the choice of friends in the quarto then imply a sense of closed communities carefully curtailing and curating family lineages, especially given the allusion to differences in blood just 4 lines earlier? Does moving away from friends in the quarto to merit in the folio signal a departure from the quarto's emphasis on familial approval and its suggestion of lineal and racial integrity? Or is this just merely a compositor's error? If it were, would that change anything? And how are we as readers and audience members implicated in this interest in racial integrity? I'll close by turning to the very end of the play, when Oberon blesses the bride beds of the newly married couples, promising that no blots of nature's hand nor marked prodigious shall appear in their children. These blots of nature's hand refer to birthmarks, hair, lip scars, etc., but by using the imagery of inky blots on white paper, these words explicitly recall a racial and a black-white heuristic and raise the spectre of marked, less than fair, and thus potentially racially differentiated children. But whereas the speech prefix Oberon, or O, appears in the quarto on the left-hand side of the screen, in the folio we get instead a stage direction, the song. But who is singing? Is it Oberon, the fairies, Titania, all of the above? And does this more collective register implicate us, the reader, the witness, the audience, in scaffolding these racial hierarchies? And how can an editor's work allow us to recognise and perhaps to resist this process? Thank you so much, and I'll now turn things over to Peter Holland.
And thanks, Urvashi, for that. I'm going to act as the medium through which your questions can be posed to any or all of the people who've already spoken. And we just have a couple so far in the Q&A list. If you have got a question you'd like to put, please enter it. Click on the Q&A button towards the top of the screen, towards the middle of it, just next to the word chat, and we'll be able to see it and we can relay it. So let me just start with one that is really directed at all of the editors, and I'll read it as it stands. A question for all. How big of a role should performance history play in an editor's commentary? Is that something reserved for performance editions? And of course, the Arden imprint has launched a new series of Arden Shakespeare performance editions just very recently, and the first few volumes are out. They're separate from the Arden Shakespeare 4th series, but they're out there very much directed at actors and directors and those seeking to put a play on. But really, let's turn to Tiffany and Patricia and Urvashi. How big of a role do you think performance history should play?
Thank you. If I can start, it is tricky. One cannot deal with all performances and the history of all performance, but I think a performance choice is as interesting and as important as a literary critical choice. And so I think one tries to get a range of senses of what historically has happened in performance, because that's part of the way the play has been historically understood. So, but obviously, I mean, you get a bit frantic with performance, because whereas you can have read, you know, a certain amount of criticism, there are a load of performances you haven't seen, but you're trying to grasp at. And I think one of the things which is tremendous, but also tricky for us, is that there are now wonderful websites like ASIA, so that you can see performances from other cultures that are in other languages, and you can think further beyond the Anglophone world than we've been able to easily before. And I think I know we're all trying to do that, but as I say, I think it's important. But I think the magnitude of all performances now and all performances over the last 400 years is also a bit horrifying.
Patricia, please do. You're muted. Your mic is muted.
Well, I'll volunteer that, particularly in thinking about stage directions, and taking a cue from Tiffany's past work, in particular, thinking about how stage directions reflect the process of theatrical professionals in the past, rather than perhaps, or like less likely than perhaps, authorial intention. So I've been thinking a lot about performances and looking back at as many as I can and reading as many records of performances pre-recording history as I can to learn about what has been done on stage with this particular moment. And I'll tell you, that's a fascinating journey in and of itself. So I do feel like an edition is very much in conversation with the performance history of the play, and very much in conversation with its performance futures. What I imagine users encounter when they come to an Arden edition is an opportunity to think productively about what a production might look like, whether that is coming from a major theater company or is the kind of production that a reader puts on in their head as they are reading the play aloud or to themselves.
By the way, Patricia, I was struck by one of the images you used as a slide, the illustration by Celis of that moment, in which clearly he has placed Iago and Roderigo as the only two with drawn swords, and Othello parting them. And that is a very particular reading that an illustrator has chosen to present. And it'll be interesting to see whether actually on stage has that been tried, and if so, who by and when.
Well, I just wanted to say, this is another rabbit hole that I've fallen down, and Peter, you've done some writing on Shakespeare illustration, because illustration turns out to be one of the other ways that past editions have intervened in the interpretation of this scene, and they're very contradictory. So a view of illustrations of this scene across the centuries also reveal some picking favorites about who's got the weapon and who's drawing the weapon and who's drawn first. So that's exciting and raises a question that we haven't touched on yet today, which is how shall you illustrate your Arden Shakespeare 4th Series edition without running afoul of some of the choices and challenges that editors have faced in the past doing the exact same thing? And I don't know the answer to that question, so I'm waiting to be educated on how to do that.
And of course, part of what you described in terms of that Othello moment is a range of performance possibilities. And then the obligation on the editor is surely to present the range of those possibilities, indicating whether they have been used, but also to leave the reader aware of this as a moment that is not, as it were, fixed, defined, unalterable. Tiffany's choice of the material in Tempest is about a single choice, is who is going to speak this speech. It's either Miranda or it's Prospero. It can't be both of them unless it is split and divided between them. Another possibility, some of it goes to Miranda, some of it goes to Prospero, though I don't think anybody's ever tried that in an edition, or indeed probably in performance. Urvashi, what about the question of the song? Because that's a very similar kind of issue.
Right, I mean, that's, so that is almost certainly, I mean, it's a question that I'm thinking about at the moment in terms of, it's an open question. And I really don't know what to do with it, to be honest, but I think it seems incredibly likely that's, it depends on how you think about the reconstruction of your edition, either as a kind of performance reconstruction, which that particular stage direction in the folio would indicate, or whether there's another kind of framework, or I hesitate to use the word intention, but another kind of framework for the edition. How do we imagine it to, what do we imagine it to be reconstructing? What do we imagine it to be reflecting? In terms of this question of performance, so more broadly, I think one of the questions that I've been thinking through, I mean, particularly with regards to Changeling Boy, which I talked about, or Changing Child, which I talked about a bit today, is I'm struck by where there's a kind of feedback loop between what productions have been interested in thinking about and what parts of which plays critics, scholars, audiences have been thinking through in terms of their racial framework. So that's why I think the Indian boy becomes a sort of outsized figure in terms of dream. And then it becomes a kind of feedback loop in terms of the history of production. And I'm struck by the fact that it's an absent figure, an absent racialized figure who commands a lot more attention in performance than, say, someone like the absent Moorish woman in The Merchant of Venice, who also impregnates, right? And so what kinds of decisions have been made about particular characters and to what ends? And how does the filling it in of these performative absences, what does that tell us about the cultural and dramatic history of these texts that we're working on?
Well, we're aware we're just a couple of minutes past our stated timeline, but we can carry on for a short period of time, I've been told by Margaret, and I'm going to suggest that I take one more question at least, and let me summarize it. It's a question about the balance between personal interpretation and something that we can see as objective fact, and how that then becomes something that we balance and negotiate in our practice as editors. How much does one think about making clear when the shift has happened between something provable, definable, and unequivocal, the Folio does say this, and something that may be personal, even though it may be masked by theory. And I'm going to incorporate the Folio reading rather than quarto subtext because I like it more, even though I argue that quarto is my basic signal of the performance I'm recreating, or whatever it may be. So it's the negotiation across that boundary that becomes a problematic one. Any of you four like to respond on that? If not, I shall pick Tiff. Yes. Go, Tiffany.
Okay, this is such a tricky one. This is such a tricky one because if you are directing the play, you are absolutely directing your interpretation. If you're editing the play, you're doing something much more tricky because on one level, you are really trying to represent a thing you think is the case. But on another level, you're a human being and everything you're doing is interpretive. So how to balance that? I'll now just very briefly, with my general editor hat on, just say that what we have asked editors to do, so what everyone will be doing, is come up with a thing, a moment that they are editing the play to. Are they editing the play to the manuscript that left Shakespeare's hands before performance? Are they editing to the first performance? Are they editing to a revised performance at court? Or what are they editing to? Asking them what they're editing to allows them maybe some kind of managed interpretation, because you're interpreting by way of trying to get back to an actual. So I think notionally, this was a way of both recognizing that we interpret and trying to circumscribe that. But as you've seen with my own examples, I get very confused. I'm trying not to put myself onto the text while being conscious that I can never be doing other than that.
And making visible yourself is something that is then an obligation, instead of pretending we're somehow invisible hands at work on something, and that it is always a matter of objective fact rather than a theorized interpretation, which again will be in a personal one, because the choice of the theory is, of course, a choice of consequence. Yes,
and it's very much, as we've seen with all this discussion, all the choices we're making are choices of this time. And, and in 50 years' time, they might admire these choices, but be horrified by kind of ecological choices or others or things that we seem to be brushing over that will seem to be absolutely crucial to the texts. So, Yeah, so I think that the most honest thing you can do is show you're working. And when you're kind of, there are 2 readings, but I'm giving this one, you know, whichever name I choose, I'll have to write a big note about how it could be the other name, for instance.
Any thoughts from Urvashi and Patricia or Rob? None at present. In which case, I'm going to suggest this is an excellent moment to call a halt to this event, to thank all the speakers, all 4 of you are there on the screen, to thank Margaret and her team at Arden for making it happen, especially Vivian for all the technical support, and to thank all of you for attending the first of a number of Folio Matters events. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you everyone for staying with us just over the hour. My one reflection on Tiffany's thoughts there about how we'll be judged in 50 years is there'll be an Arden 5, so don't worry about that. One day. But thank you so much, everyone. I find it completely fascinating. It's why I love my job so much. So thank you all. This recording will be available, and please do look at Folio Matters. There are other little videos to whet your appetite ahead of our launching the series early in 2025, which is not so very far away, so not too long to wait. And on that note, I'll thank our speakers and Peter for chairing us and all my colleagues and let everyone go. But thank you so much.